Hi everyone, thank you all for coming to our first colloquium of the year. And this is actually a special colloquium because it's sponsored by the Starkey Duncan Memorial Fund, very generously donated by Starkey's family. And Starkey was a wonderful colleague that just disappeared on us. And thousands of students, I think, owe him basically guidance out of out of his just generosity, not part of his job description. And this is fitting that it also funds students today, or at least post-students. So Dale...
What are you saying?
Dale Barr, it's really my pleasure to introduce him. He thought that when he did his dissertation defense, he was done. Not so. We actually will call you back.
That's right.
And so let me tell you a little bit about Dale. He came here as a grad student and, did an amazing job, basically teaching me things. And then we actually started out a research program on communication and perspective taking, and fairly quickly pissed off lots of people. Lots of famous people. And then Dale went on and for many years continued to do this very, very well.
Yes. I learned from the best.
So I have to say, so he has done very, very important work and very good work, and that's partly why it's difficult to complain about if he argues against you, because I think Dale's work has a lot of intellectual integrity, and in addition to the intellectual courage that he shows by kind of standing his ground and focusing on the science, really. And so there's a lot of important contribution in communication, coordination, language understanding, and also in very important methodological contributions in how we should be analyzing data. And there are also big controversies there, but I think that there's no question that Dale has already made a very, very strong mark. Now a little bit of history. He first went to Santa Cruz for his BA and came here, and he finished in '93, a long time ago.
Let's see.
And he finished here at '99, and then did a postdoc at the Beckman Institute. The first one from
For language.
For language, to do a postdoc there. It's typically natural sciences, and then I got a job at UC Riverside, and then I decided to go to Scotland, and it's been at Glasgow ever since. I think they managed to keep him there because they convinced him that they really keep the best single malts to themselves. Dale Barr.
Thanks a lot.
So there's a plaque that comes with this lecture to show that he was invited here to give the Starkey Duncan Memorial Lecture. This is for you, and I'll give you even a stand later.
Thanks a lot.
And I want to make one more announcement. Right after the talk, we will have a reception at the Social Sciences Tea Room.
Right.
You know where this is, everybody? If not, come with me. So please join us. There's a lot of food, so you should.
Great, thanks a lot. So thank you for that nice introduction. and thank you for inviting me here. It's really, I don't think I've ever been as honored as I was when I received the invitation from Amanda to come here and give a lecture. So thank you so much for that. Chicago is one of the first places I ever really felt like home in a lot of ways, especially intellectually. And so it does feel to me like a homecoming after a long time. So 20 years ago, that was me, and that's my pickup truck. And I loaded everything I owned into the back of that truck, and I drove it from California out to Chicago, having really no idea what awaited me there. I had just finished my bachelor's at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I believed at the time that I was interested in studying metaphor and conceptual metaphor, so I was off to Chicago to study that with Boaz. But I had no idea what was in store for me, and if I knew, I wouldn't have turned around. I would have driven faster, because it turned out to be one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I felt like Chicago is a very special place, and I do feel with my meetings with people today that it still remains a very special and unique place. And I think the students who are here now, I hope you take advantage of that, because there are not so many places like Chicago. It was a place where I felt welcomed with open arms by the entire community. And even though I had Boaz as a mentor and I had Terry Regier as a mentor, I felt like I was really brought up by the entire department. And that was very special. And I also felt like I was really encouraged to think deeply about the issues that I was studying and always try to have a big idea guiding my research. I'd like to say a few things about the man in whose honor I'm giving this talk, Starkey Duncan. It's really unfortunate that those of you who are here won't have the chance to meet Starkey. He's really just a really kind and generous person. And even though he was not a direct mentor, he had, I was thinking about this, he actually had a massive influence on what I'm doing. And I kind of didn't realize this until I was putting together the talk, and I was thinking about my memories of Starkey. I remember when I arrived, I had the pro seminar, which I think is still happening, and we heard about all the different research that was going on. And Starkey was presenting about feeding rituals between caregivers and infants, and talking about, and basically, analyzing videotapes, recordings of feeding interactions, and doing these very detailed analyses of what went on and how infants and their caregivers would establish kind of conventions and rituals that allowed them to kind of coordinate their behavior. And I thought that was really fascinating, but I mean, I was interested in metaphor and other things, and so I didn't see its relevance until much later. I worked with Boaz for a while, and then when I was about to do my dissertation, I had read a few papers by my current colleague at University of Glasgow, Simon Garrett, talking about conventionality, and I became very interested in this topic, and I had remembered meeting with Starkey. And I had remembered hearing about Starkey's research, so I went back to talk to him, and I said, I'm interested in doing something on conventions and discourse, and how people establish conventions and discourse, and how this influences how they process language. And he said, that's great. Go read this philosophical monograph from 1969 by David Lewis. So he introduced me to David Lewis's theory of convention, which, if you read my dissertation, I don't recommend that you do, but if you do read my dissertation, you'll see that that was basically the framework for my research then, and it has gone on to influence what I've done since then. So even though he was not directly my advisor, he had a massive influence on my thinking, because he was a true scholar. And it's not very often that someone will tell you nowadays, say to a student, go read this philosophical monograph before you write your dissertation. But that says something about the depth of his thought and the depth of his scholarship. he also was hugely influential in the study of social interaction and nonverbal communication. And that's also relevant for my work on conversational interaction. So Chicago was very lucky to have Starkey, and I feel very lucky to have known him. So I want to talk a little bit about Lewis's theory of convention. What you see here on the left, I don't know if you can make it out, this is what happened when social conventions break down. This is Stockholm in 1967, when they decided they were tired of driving on the left-hand side and they wanted to drive on the right-hand side. So you can see the kind of chaos that this creates. So as you know, it's arbitrary which side of the street you choose to drive on. What's important is that everybody drives on the same side. So in Lewis's framework, he kind of basically took ideas from game theory and applied them to all kinds of social problems, and developed the idea that we have these recurring coordination problems, like coordinating traffic, coordinating the flow of traffic. Anytime you get in the car and you want to go somewhere, right, you have to coordinate with the other drivers so you don't crash into them. And through these coordination problems, we develop conventions. And these are solutions to these recurring coordination problems. And the reason why we follow these conventions is because it's rational to do so, right? It is not rational to say, I'm tired of driving on the right. Today I'm going to drive on the left, right? You're going to create a mess. And we have mutual expectations that the other people that we interact with are also going to have reason to follow these conventions. Okay? So this was, part of the way Starkey thought about things as well, and the kind of realization was that this could also be applied to communication. So work by Herb Clark and others had kind of taken Lewis's framework and applied it to how people communicate. And communication is a kind of coordination problem, right? Because we produce sounds, but we don't have direct access to what other people are thinking. So by virtue of these symbolic conventions, we can arrive at a common understanding. And you can see that this often breaks down, right? So you have a guy saying, oh, there's a pit here, trying to tell the other person who just thinks he's trying to just show how agitated he is, and then they end up falling into the pit. So one of the things about common knowledge that is kind of perplexing is that it seems extremely important in conventions and why people follow conventions, and it seems extremely important in language. But if you break it down, common knowledge, for that to exist, requires an infinite number of conditions to be satisfied. So you get into this complicated infinite regress. So I might know something, maybe you know it too. I have to know that you know it, right? But I have to know that you know that I know that you know it, and so on. You can just keep going on and on and on, interminably. Now, Clark and Marshall have suggested that common knowledge, existence of common knowledge or mutual knowledge, is really the only guarantee of successful communication. So we can only take things for granted if they're part of common knowledge. And what they suggested to kind of resolve this issue is that we all have the notion of common knowledge. We all have this as a sort of a conceptual primitive. And in fact, there's now some interesting research by Thomas and colleagues, Steven Pinker was on this paper as well from Harvard, suggesting that actually humans do have this notion as a sort of a special concept, and that we can infer that this holds through some kind of co-presence heuristic. So we don't have to actually compute all of these stages. We can just say, well, if we're in the same environment, anything that's physically present will also be present to you, so we can assume that it's common knowledge. If I've said something in the discourse and you were present, right, I can assume that we share that information. If we're part of the same community, we're all part of the community of English speakers, I can assume that you have understanding of the words and the syntax of English. Okay? So let me get to another paradox, which is the PhD Supervisor Paradox. So how did I end up working with this guy? Actually, as I mentioned, when I came to Chicago, I thought I was going to study metaphor. And I'm sure Boaz remembers this. The problem is the kind of metaphor that I wanted to study was a kind of metaphor that Boaz wasn't really that fond of. So talk about an infinite regress. Trying to do my first trial research project with Boaz, we went back and forth over an experimental design. And at some point, I realized, actually, Boaz is probably right about this whole metaphor thing. Maybe I'm going to do something else. And in the meantime, Boaz was also doing some work on common ground. He had just published 2 papers on the topic. One was a solo paper on perception of sarcasm, and the other one was a project with Sid Horton. I guess that was ongoing at the time when I arrived, which was finding sort of egocentric effects in production. So Boaz was finding all of these interesting violations of common knowledge. And around the time, I guess it was like my second year, Boaz got money for an eye tracker. So through some maneuvering, he was able to secure an eye tracker, and that started us off on a whole line of research that actually continues to this day. You may have seen these kinds of diagrams before. This is a diagram showing kind of the first study that we did. So we had this grid actually the first grid I made out of foam board. And we wanted to set up a situation where people would have different perspectives and see if they could use common ground in understanding language. So we had people sit across from each other and play this communication game. So there would be like one of these grids on the table, like this one. And the director, person talking to you, would see things from one side, and you would see things from the other. Critically, there were things that you could see that the director couldn't see. So for example, there's this candle here, and there's an apple there, right? So we call these privileged objects. And so the speaker would say something like, now pick up the small candle. So the question from the director's view, right, obviously this is the smaller of the 2 candles. From your view, right, there's this candle, but there's also an even smaller one. So this task required that you actually kind of ignore this privileged information. And we got this eye tracker thinking like, okay, it'll be great if people actually just, glance at this object before they figured this one out, because we figured, oh, this is so easy, right? They just have to ignore these hidden ones. What we ended up finding, and I think why this line of research ended up being influential, was we found that people were actually picking up these hidden objects and moving them, even though it was very clear that the speaker didn't know about these objects. And we've replicated this under like lots of different conditions. There was only one case where it didn't replicate, which I'll get into later. But I'm not going to actually talk about these studies now. What I do want to say is, I think I felt like, at least what we did kind of had an impact, right? Kind of feel like a sense of pride, like I did this when I was in graduate school, and, look at the impact that it's had. So if we look at some quotes from the literature, you can kind of see the impact. So this is the state of the affairs in 1994. No one had really looked at common ground and common knowledge and comprehension, and so Clark and Carlson are putting down the gauntlet and saying, go out and study and show us that people, whether or not they use common ground. So how about 2014, when this paper by Pinker et al. Appeared, I thought, okay, we have this 20 years of research. It turns out that actually we had very little impact, I guess. So I'm glad I get to talk to you today, because you probably don't know about this research. So, but actually, I think it's not true that we don't know much about the psychology of common knowledge. It's true that little is known to be known about the psychology of common knowledge. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I want to make 3 claims, and I'm going to present evidence for each of these claims. The general point, and I think this is a point coming from Boaz's research and now from my research, all the stuff we've done together, is that common knowledge is important. I'm not out to deny that. It has a limited explanatory scope in communication and behavior. That's basically the idea. First of all, I'll show you from some computer simulations that you don't have to have common knowledge to get conventions off the ground. They can emerge simply as a byproduct of interactions between individual speakers and listeners. The second point is that I'm going to present evidence that even if you do attend to common ground and common knowledge, there are levels of language processing that seem completely oblivious to this information, that operate apparently entirely egocentric. So common knowledge is not really fully integrated into the language comprehension architecture. And finally, so common ground and common knowledge have done a lot of heavy lifting in theories of pragmatics and theories of language use. But what I'm going to argue is that we can actually get away to some extent without them, because some of these processes can be mimicked by simpler cognitive processes. All right. So the first part of my talk, I'll talk about whether common knowledge is necessary to establish conventions in a community. And this was work that I did after leaving Chicago. Was actually directly inspired by reading Lewis's monograph on conventions. There's a chapter in there where Lewis talks about symbolic conventions and the kinds of reasoning that should underlie such conventions. And it kind of raised the question in my head of, when I read this, of whether actually this kind of strategic reasoning is really necessary to get conventions off the ground. So it's very difficult, it would be very difficult to kind of do this study empirically, to actually create communities and have them interact for, I don't know, a long enough period of time to develop conventions. So at the time, I did this all using computer simulation. So the questions were, how much knowledge do individual agents need in order to be able to communicate with each other? And can these emerge as a byproduct of their individual attempts at communication within communication dyads? So what I did, I developed a computer simulation where there were these agents and they all had a lexicon, so a store of symbolic representations that consisted of 4 meanings that they could communicate and 4 symbols that they could use to communicate these meanings. So it's a really kind of a toy model of language, very simplified. And initially, each agent would have a random lexicon. So there was nothing systematic, nothing built into the community, just a random lexicon. And what would happen was they would pair up with other agents inside the computer somewhere, and then they would try to communicate, and they'd be given feedback whether they successfully communicated or not. So yeah, you got it right. No, you got it wrong. But they're not told. If they got it right, they know, they were correct. But if they got it wrong, they're not told why they got it wrong. Okay. And there were two main parameters that I wanted to explore in these simulations, both of which are related to this notion of common knowledge, sort of how much knowledge you have about what's going on in your community. One of these parameters is neighborhood size. So the agents live in a 2-dimensional world. They live in a rectangle. And each agent has a neighborhood. Those are the neighboring agents. So one thing you can vary is how far an agent will go out of its neighborhood to interact with other people. Right? So each agent has a little Gaussian around them that determines who they'll interact with. They're most likely to interact with people close to them. They're less likely to interact with people far away, and you can expand that Gaussian to sort of change that. The second variable was memory size. So one set of agents in the simulations, they followed a simple algorithm. for updating. So what would happen is they would communicate. If they got it correct, they would keep their mappings. If they got it wrong, they would change their mappings in some way. And with memory size, what would happen is if they got it wrong, the memory size determined how far back into the past they would look in order to change their mappings. So they try to change their mappings to improve communication, and memory size indexes how far back in the past they're going to look. So both of these things are, you can think of them as kind of ways in which agents track what's going on in their community. Okay? So here's an example of an interaction between two agents. Each agent is a square here, right? These are their lexicons. So they have 4 meanings. We can just say that they're letters. And they have 4 forms, which are numbers. One agent is assigned to be the speaker. The other agent is assigned to be the listener. They go through the meanings. So the first one, the speaker activates meaning K and produces a 4. The listener observes 4 and retrieves the associated meaning H. So in this case, they got it wrong. Okay? And in each interaction, they would do all 4 meanings in a random order. So you have a population of 1,000 agents all doing these interactions kind of in parallel. So each epoch is, consists of random pairings of all the agents doing one interaction. Okay? What's interesting is, so that's all these agents do. They have no conception of being in a community. They're just egocentric. The first thing that you see is if you look at the number of languages in the population as a function of the epoch, right? So there are 4 meanings and 4 forms. That means there are 24 different languages that an agent can speak. Each one of these lines is for a different community size. And you can see that there is a drop in the number of languages represented in the community. So they are converging to particular languages. So if you have a small community neighborhood size of 3, you can see you get rather rapid convergence toward 4 or 5 languages in the community. What's interesting is that with the bigger community sizes, you get slower convergence. So even though they're sampling from a broader swath of the population, right, convergence is impaired, which is kind of surprising given the view of common knowledge. What's really interesting is, and I wish I could actually play the simulations for you, but it wasn't technically possible. You see the emergence of dialects. So this is a randomized, each one of these is a randomized population at the start. This is 100 epochs into it and 500 epochs into it. And this is a community neighborhood size of 3 and neighborhood size of 14. If you look over time, you start to get these pockets of languages that are kind of spatially organized into dialects. So even though you have multiple languages in the community, the actual accuracy of these agents is very high because they're talking to people who are like them, right? The people who are closest to them are like them. So you get this kind of spontaneous organization, spontaneous self-organization of the community into little sub-communities that all kind of speak the same dialect. Here was another finding that was surprising, and this suggests that more memory is not necessarily a good thing as far as converging on a common language. So this is the mean epochs to converge on the vertical axis, and this is the number of epochs each agent looks back in its memory to update its representations. And there's a sweet spot at 2. So you get very quick convergence onto a single language when you have a memory size of 2. So you're only looking at your previous 2 interactions. If you increase your memory size, which you would think should improve convergence because you're sampling more broadly from the population, it actually takes longer for the population to converge. If you go beyond this point, the population very rarely converges. Okay? And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. It kind of makes sense to this in the sense that each community is shooting at a moving target. So the information that each agent has gets quickly outdated. Okay? So a really small memory is actually good in that kind of circumstance. So both of these things, the effective neighborhood size, the effective memory, suggests that common knowledge is not always necessary to get conventions to emerge. In fact, too much knowledge, too much thinking about what's going on around you can have a detrimental effect. Okay. And importantly, these community-wide conventions can spontaneously emerge just as a byproduct of each agent's attempts to understand the other agents in its environment. So we don't really need common knowledge to get conventions off the ground. Okay, now I'd like to switch gears, talk about common knowledge in comprehension. So the key question I've been looking at has really been how people make use of conventions, linguistic conventions, in communication. So you hear words all the time that are phonologically and pragmatically ambiguous. So words like the candle. So that's temporarily ambiguous. You hear can, it could be candle, candy, other words. Also pragmatically ambiguous. So what is the person referring to? Which candle is the person talking about? Now, common knowledge could be very effective in reducing this ambiguity, right? Reducing the phonological ambiguity. So if you know what a speaker is likely to talk about, what's in your common knowledge, you can make predictions about what words they're likely to use, and that should make comprehension more accurate. You could also use it to predict what they're referring to as well, not just the words that they will use. So how effectively can listeners use this information? And what I'm going to show you is actually surprisingly ineffectively. They're not very good at it. In these studies, so unlike the grid studies that I did while I was here with Boaz, for various reasons, I kind of abandoned that in my lab. Part of the reason was it took a long time to set up the grid, and it would also sometimes fall over on top of the participant. I was looking, we have one of our videotapes, we have the grid, we have a video of the grid falling, and I'd like to look for that. Yeah, it's hilarious. I mean, we were dying laughing. So we do everything like using a computer now, presenting pictures on a screen and having people click on things with a mouse. And we're also using eye tracking, visual world eye tracking. And so what is nice about this, and this technique was really developed by people at the University of Rochester, so Mike Tannenhouse and colleagues. It really gives us a window onto language processing and how it evolves over time. Actually, this kind of plot I should mention, since I'm at the University of Chicago, one of the developers of this type of visualization of visual world eye tracking was Jim Magnuson, who was he was an undergraduate here, and then went on to work at the University of Rochester. So what we're looking at here is, look at these four pictures. There's a bucket, there's an elephant, a mug, and a buckle, and you hear something like click on the bucket, right? So bucket this word is initially phonologically ambiguous between the bucket and the buckle, right, that first syllable. What you can do is you can plot the probability that people will look at each of these different kinds of objects over time, and that gives you an index of what's going on in their minds. So usually you don't see any effects until about 200 milliseconds after the onset of a word, because it takes about that long to program an eye movement. So this is 200 milliseconds after the onset of the word buckle. And you can see they're roughly equal to look at all the different kinds of objects. So the T, the black line, is the bucket. The C, I'll call that the competitor. The red line is the buckle. It's a phonological competitor. The gray line is the probability of looking at either the mug or the elephant, so something that doesn't match the input. And you can see that the probabilities evolve dynamically as you're listening to the word, okay? So the probability of looking at the bucket and the buckle, they kind of go up together until about 500 milliseconds, and then they diverge because you're hearing the end of that word, which disambiguates it to the target, to bucket. Okay? And this is a really useful technique for studying language processing and for studying the effects of context on language processing. Because what you can do, here you have a lexical competition effect, which I'll define as the difference between this line and this gray line. So that, the area between those two lines, that's your lexical competition effect. We can see how we can play around with that effect. We can see how context attenuates that effect or exacerbates that effect or whatever. Okay? And it allows us, by looking at this in terms of lexical competition, we can actually isolate a particular level of processing and look to see whether common ground or common knowledge affects that level of processing. Okay, so this was this is probably the first study I did after I left University of Chicago and arrived at Beckman Institute. And it had, I really thought that this was going to kill the research that Boaz and I had done, that this was going to kill our theory. And it kind of did and it kind of didn't. You'll have to just wait and I'll explain what that cryptic utterance means. So anyway, you would see 4 objects on the screen, and you're playing a communication game with a speaker in another room. Okay, and that speaker is telling you to click on different pictures. The trick was that one of the 4 pictures, which we call the critical object, half the time it was a lexical competitor. So if you heard bucket, it was a buckle. Half the time it was a non-competitor. So by comparing the probabilities for that, we get the lexical competition effect. Now we do something else. So in half the trials, this object you would believe is shared with the speaker. So the speaker sees that object on their screen, they know about it. That's a shared condition. The other half of the trials, you think the speaker doesn't know what that object is. It's blocked out on their screen. So it's a privileged object. So the question is, what does this do to the lexical competition effect? Okay. Now the reason why I thought, so Boaz and I had talked about, comprehension being egocentric. The reason why I thought this was going to kill that idea was because all we're asking people to do is ignore this object in one condition. All they have to do is not look at it. That's it. So it's very easy. So this is what I found in that study. So this is your lexical competition effect, the same thing I was showing before. The C is looking at the buckle, and the N is when it's a stepladder. So you get that effect, and you can calculate your competition effect over here. Okay? So that was interesting. Now, what happened when you thought the speaker didn't know about that object? Okay, it's privilege. This is what happened. Both of those lines move down, but the lexical competition effect does not change. It's identical. So what we're showing, in fact, where Boaz and I were wrong, what we had said was people don't really pay attention initially to common ground. They kind of use it to monitor and correct errors. What we're seeing is people are paying attention to common ground early on. It creates a big bias to look away from things that the speaker doesn't know about. But what this is showing is that is not being incorporated into lexical processing. It's not modulating lexical competition effect. Okay? So this was actually a really exciting result because it was the first time I'd ever seen in a visual world study evidence for some kind of encapsulation, if you will, of processing from a higher level. So of course, wasn't able to publish that as it was. Therein lies the story of how we made people mad by basically arguing for unpopular modularity. So the next thing I did was I needed to replicate this finding, but I also wanted to convince people that we weren't really arguing for encapsulation in like a Fodorian sense, and the idea being that lexical processing is not influenced by any kind of context. What I wanted to test was whether it could be influenced by something like linguistic association, some kind of linguistic context, in a way that the situational context could not influence it. So I replicated the study, but I also introduced another condition, another way of excluding this critical object that didn't involve common ground. It just involved the speech leading up to the mention of the noun. So, so here, you either hear click on the bucket, just like in the shared condition, but if we want to make the critical object implausible, you now hear empty the bucket, right? So you can empty the bucket, you can empty the mug, you can not empty the elephant, as far as I know, and you can't empty a buckle or a stepladder. So the verb plays the same role as the privileged manipulation or privileged level here. So it excludes that object. So what happens there? Do we get lexical competition in that case? And how does that relate to what we see here? So first show you what happens when you have the verb. And I'm going to do it in an animated way. So this is basically your lexical competition effect. What I want to show you here is you can think about this as the prior probability. So the verb is actually changing the prior probability that the speaker will mention the buckle or the stepladder, right, when they say empty. they're just not going to talk about a buckle or step ladder when they say empty. So the prior is really low. Okay? What's interesting is with this information here, we can actually use Bayes' theorem to predict if you're an optimal integrator, if you're an optimal listener, how the interference should look. And it should look like that. That's how the interference should look if you are completely Bayesian and you can fully integrate this information. And it doesn't look too bad. It looks pretty close. What about common ground? So this is, you get a similarly large effect on the prior. So if you think the speaker doesn't know about that object, you don't really look at it very much. And this is the prediction from a Bayesian model. That's how much interference we should see if you are Bayesian, but this is basically what we saw. So massive, massive interference. So again, this does seem to suggest listeners do attend to this information, but the lexical system is somehow not responding to it. Okay? This is actually a follow-up that isn't published yet. It's a study we just completed where we wanted to actually vary the strength of cues over the course of an experiment and see the effects of this cue variation on lexical competition. It doesn't have to do with common knowledge per se, but it has to do with your ability to integrate situational variations in cues into lexical processing. Okay? So is there something special about common knowledge, or is it just any kind of situational context, right, that you have problems integrating? So the idea here was to teach people an arbitrary cue, teach people to attend to that arbitrary cue, and they'll learn over the course of the experiment, the target's going to be this kind of object. But it's just completely arbitrary, right? But they'll learn that over the course of the experiment. So the prior for that object should increase over the experiment. The question is, what happens to the lexical competitors that are not in that set? If the prior increases for things that are within the set, then the lexical competition from things that are outside of that set should decrease if you're able to integrate that information. It should stay the same if you can't integrate it. Okay? So that was part of it. Take an arbitrary cue, teach it to people, show how it evolves over the course of the experiment, and see the effect on lexical competition. The other thing that we did was we tried to teach people to unlearn a predictive cue. We tried to teach people that verbs are bad predictors of nouns. Okay? So it's actually hard to teach people this because verbs are usually so predictive. So what we did was we had these test trials that we embedded within these nonsense trials. So you would hear eat the sandwich and you have sandwich and sandals, right? But then on another trial you'd hear stir the bike, or you would hear trick the fire, or polish the goose. So you just learn over time that, it's just like this whimsical language, right? You shouldn't make strong predictions about what noun is going to come when you hear a verb. I should mention, in this case, the arbitrary cue that we taught them, I forgot to mention that, was they would learn over time, incidentally, that the target was always on this diagonal. And it was never on this diagonal, right? Always on this diagonal. And we would put the competitor, lexical competitor, off the diagonal to see what happened, okay? They didn't see any of the green boxes or the red circles. That's just there for you, okay? So they would they're supposed to learn to attend to this arbitrary cue, and they're supposed to ignore this reliable cue. So if they're able to ignore the reliable cue, the prior probability of looking at things that match should go down, and the lexical competition should go up, okay? So that's what we're trying to do. This is just checking that our manipulation works. So in the situational version where they're learning to pay attention to things on the diagonal, you're seeing first quarter of the experiment, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, you're seeing they're learning to attend to that. It's going up. And in the semantic condition where they're sort of learning to ignore the semantics of the verb, you can see they're less and less likely to look at things that match the verb. So we're having the effect on the prior that we wanted. Okay? Now what happens to lexical competition? This is in the situational constraint condition where the competitor is off that diagonal. I'm going to show you the curves from each of the four quarters. So this is that's lexical competition. That's the effect. So that's the solid line minus the dashed line. That's the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. So we're not really seeing any change in the lexical competition. It should be going down. It's not. Okay, what about the verb semantic manipulation? This is our fairly small competition effect we get in the first quarter. That should be going up over time because verbs are no longer predictive, right? You could say polish the goose. You could say eat the sandal, right? And we don't see that either. We see no change in the competition, or I should say no evidence for change. I do teach statistics, and sometimes I forget to say that. No evidence for change. Okay, and this is on video too, that's scary. Well, what about, that's one experiment. What about a lifetime of experience? Okay, and this is where we get into a kind of interesting backstory here. After I left the lab, Shali Wu arrived. Some of you may know Shali. She had heard about our experiments with the grid and our wild claims about people being egocentric. And she said, Chinese people won't do that, right? And I think, as I understand it, Boaz tried to, steer her in a more profitable direction, thinking, don't waste your time. We've already done it. It always works. It always replicates. Do something else. But she was adamant about doing it, so eventually they did the study. And they found something surprising. So reason why you might expect Chinese people not to show egocentrism is, there's large cultural differences in terms of orientation to others versus kind of more individuality and focus on individual goals and achievements. So does this greater focus on other people in Chinese culture, does that lead to better perspective taking? And I'm just going to say the short answer from Shali's and Boaz's study was yes. Actually, very striking behavioral findings. So it was actually, this is kind of misleading because in this experiment, it wasn't the small candle kind of manipulation. There were two candles and one was hidden, and you hear move the candle, and they're both equally good candles. So you're not going to, if there are two candles and the speaker says move the candle, you're not just going to arbitrarily pick one to move if you're egocentric. You're going to ask for clarification. So that's sort of the measure of egocentrism in this. Do you ask for clarification? When from the speaker's point of view, there's only one possible referent. What they found was that 65% of the Americans asked for clarification or move the, I guess they did sometimes move the hidden competitor. I could be wrong, I don't know. They're Americans. 65% of Americans asked for clarification at least once during the experiment. Only one Chinese participant did over the entire experiment. They went for the right one. They didn't ask for clarification. And this was done, of course, with the Chinese participants, this was done in Chinese. So this was actually really surprising and provocative. This was like really the first time we ever made that effect go away. I say we, but it was you and Shali. And of course, I had been working on these other experiments I just told you about, suggesting that comprehension is encapsulated. So kind of threw me for a loop. So I contacted them and said, let me see your data. I don't believe it. We need to look at what's going on over time, because what could be happening with the eye track, with the eye movements, you could have this early interference in both groups, and perhaps Chinese participants are better at suppressing and they just aren't acting on that interference. So that's what we did. We went back to the data, and you could think of this almost as like the lexical competition effect again. It's sort of similar, except we have full ambiguity instead of temporary ambiguity. So this is sort of the pattern of interference you get for American participants. This is the pattern that you get for the Chinese participants. So you can see it's pretty much the same. What's different is about 1,200, 1,300 milliseconds. You see this sharp drop for the Chinese participants. So it's not that they're not experiencing this interference, which would suggest that they're able to incorporate common ground in ways that Westerners can't. They are experiencing that interference. They're just better at suppressing it. Okay? Finally, the last part of the talk, I want to talk about things that could substitute for common knowledge, so things that could help listeners understand speakers, but without requiring this complex reasoning about what the speaker knows. So I've recently argued that perhaps what happens is, in some cases, that language users are able to communicate successfully by this using a heuristic called attribute substitution, which you'll find in the judgment and decision-making literature. It's proposed by Kahneman and Frederick. So they say judgment is mediated by a heuristic when an individual assesses a specified target attribute of a judgment object by substituting another property of that object, the heuristic attribute, which more readily comes to mind. So instead of answering the question that you're being asked, you answer a simpler question, in other words. And so maybe what happens when people are resolving references, they're not trying to find the referent that is in common ground with the listener. They're trying to answer a different question. So what question might that be, and how might they be answering it? So I'm just going to tell you about one more study. I'm actually going to skip this study. I can talk about it later if people are interested. This first study was on understanding negation. But I really want to get to this other study about proper names. This is a recent study that we did in Glasgow. So proper names are actually really interesting, and it provide a really interesting way to study common ground and reference resolution, because proper names are highly ambiguous. So out of 11 million boys born in the US in 2011, that's half of all boys that were born, they shared 140 names. So you got one of 140 names, that's 11 million people. Right? You can imagine John, Kevin, Bob, all those names. Proper names are highly ambiguous. And among friends, everybody's had this experience where you're talking to somebody and they're talking about Kevin, and conversation's going on for a while, and then you realize you're thinking of a different Kevin that they're thinking of, or you're thinking of a different John that they're thinking of. And in fact, the John that you're thinking of wouldn't even make sense for them to be talking about because they probably don't know it. So I think a lot of us have had these experiences, or you have these double takes where I had one where I was asked, about Kevin, we're talking in a discussion about my son's childcare, and I know I had mentioned Kevin. And the person I was talking to just thought about a friend of ours named Kevin, a middle-aged man who was not in childcare with my son. So I think all of us have these kinds of weird double takes that we do. And so this experiment was kind of neat because we looked at why we do that. And what we wanted to investigate was two possible ways that people can resolve proper names. One is just common knowledge. So you say Kevin, and I think about the Kevins that I know and the Kevins that you know, and I can form an intersection of that set, and that gives me some idea about which Kevins you might talk about, and then I might think about the context of the conversation and which ones do you know that I know, which ones, and so on. So we could figure out Kevin that way. We can work through our kind of mental Rolodexes or whatever and combine them and figure out which one is being referred to. Another possibility, and this is where attribute substitution comes in, is that perhaps we're doing something totally different. So when we talk about people, when we refer to people, we're not just hearing phonemes. We're hearing a person's voice, and we're hearing the quality of a person's voice. When Boaz refers to Kevin, he'll say it in his Boaz voice. When I refer to Kevin, I'll say it in my Dale voice, right, and so on. And so you can actually establish an association, triadic association, between a name said in a particular voice and a particular person, right? So initially, when I'm talking to someone, I might have to go through all this complex reasoning about who is this person talking about, but I have now established an episodic association relating that name said in that voice to a particular person. And perhaps just hearing that causes me to retrieve the appropriate referent, okay? And we build up these kinds of associations through our interactions. So how do we know whether we use this strategy. One thing that we can do is we can actually dissociate the identity of the person who designs an utterance, who designs a message, from the person who actually delivers it, from the person who actually speaks it, right? So I could be reading aloud an email from Boaz that said, call Anne, or something like that, right? It's Boaz saying Anne, right? Not me, and maybe I'm saying it to Howard, right? But it's Boaz's message delivered in my voice. So we can take apart the designer, the source, and the actual physical cues that might be associated with the referent. This is what we did in this study. It's a very complicated study, and I met last week. I met with Sid Horton, who's also a former Chicago student who's now at Northwestern. He told me that in their lab they have what's called the Dale-Barr experiment, which is an overly complicated Baroque experiment that's very hard to explain in a talk. So let me try to walk you through this. This is a really fun experiment to run. We got actual pairs of friends from the undergraduate population. So instead of establishing common ground in the lab like we normally do, we actually surveyed them to figure out who their friends were in their class cohort, who they knew, who they mutually knew, who one person knew but the other person didn't know, and who neither one of them knew. So we had these 20 pairs come into the lab. First thing they did was they put them in separate rooms. They went through an online pre-experiment survey. They looked at pictures of the other students in their class. They said, I know that person, yes. I don't know that person, no. They did this with all 146 photos that we had. If they said they knew the person, then we asked them, does your friend know the person? Yes or no. So we can, from that we can tell whether or not this person is mutually known. We also asked them how often you talk about that person. So we had information about all of that. So it was kind of cool because we mapped out the social networks among the participants in our study, and we also took advantage of naturally occurring common knowledge. And then once we had mapped that out, we used that information to generate stimuli for the experiment. So it was tailored to each participant. And I wouldn't be able to do this without the R programming language, by the way. There's a lot of scripting involved. So we set up these, there are these displays. You can't really read that, but the point is, these are silhouettes because I couldn't show the actual pictures. We need to preserve their identities, right? So in any given display, there would be two people that were shared between the speaker and the listener. They knew these people. There was one person that was privileged to the listener. So the listener knew who that person was. And then there was one person who was unknown. And then the speaker would refer to one of those pictures. Now, the key thing was, not only did we have the friend, we also had the experimenter's assistant. Okay? So this is somebody who did not know the listener, didn't have any kind of people in common with the listener. We needed that person because of their voice, basically. And we developed a note passing scheme so we can manipulate who designs a message. Is it the assistant or is it the friend? And who delivers the message? Is it the assistant or is it the friend? So it was very complicated, and the undergraduates who ran this wanted to kill me after doing this, but you can see why. This is the flowchart that we developed that is in the paper, and I'll allow you to study that on your own time if you'd like to know the details of how we did all this. It was very complicated. Initially, it was a 2x2 design, right? And we're like, yay, let's go, 2x2 design. And then right before we were about to do it, I realized, there's a confound. Need to add another factor. Because what I realized was there's an effect in the literature that you're better at understanding familiar voices than unfamiliar voices. So if we found facilitation, hearing something in your friend's voice, it could just be you're more familiar with that voice. So we'd done all this work, ready to launch. We realized we needed another condition. So we had another condition where the target was privileged person, so it's not shared anymore. So any difference between these two conditions only can be due to episodic associations, not to familiarity with the voice. Okay? So a nice 2x2x2 design. Okay. This is really, the chart at the top is really what I want to focus on, because this is the probability of looking at the target, the person that's mentioned. This person is shared, right? Probability of looking at that over time in each of the 4 conditions. So you could see the 2 dark lines are higher than the 2 gray lines. Those 2 dark lines are the condition where the friend is the messenger. The friend is producing the speech. It doesn't matter who designed it. It only matters who's saying it. Okay? And we get this nice advantage for hearing a name in the friend's voice, regardless of whether or not the friend had actually designed it. We don't see that when you're talking about a privileged reference, so it's not driven by the voice familiarity. Okay, so that basically shows you that there are ways where you can you can resolve references without involving common knowledge, right? Just by taking advantage of regularities in the environment. So to summarize, I've basically argued that common knowledge has an explanatory there are limits on the explanatory scope of common knowledge. It's not necessary for establishing symbolic conventions. It's not fully integrated into comprehension, and it can be mimicked by other processes such as episodic associations and episodic priming. There are some critiques to this, but I can get to those in the question and answer session if you like. So what does this all mean? Why are things organized this way? I'm not really sure, but like one plausible explanation, one speculation is that it's just our comprehension system is being optimized towards speed. So accessing and using common knowledge is probably effortful. There's some evidence that it does require effort to infer and to use this information. So if you put people under load, they have a harder time using common knowledge. One interesting speculation is that perhaps what comprehension is optimized toward is understanding a generic speaker, not the person talking to you, and their beliefs, but kind of a generic person who shares your knowledge, what they would say and how they would say it. And we see this because, so you see these long-term statistical associations like empty the bucket. These kinds of associations influence lexical processing, whereas these kind of situational types of constraints don't appear to do so. And I think it's an interesting question to explore how widely attribute substitution can provide an alternative to common knowledge. It's not clear it can really do the work that it would need to do to explain all successful communication. So why has common knowledge, why have theorists given it such a big job in the study of language use? So it's done a lot of heavy explanatory lifting within theories of language use. And I think actually what it comes down to has to do with idealizations that we make about how language works. First of all, most analyses of language use are really focused on dyadic communication, but kind of forget that each dyad is part of a larger network of interacting individuals, and we're all mutually affecting each other, such that people become more and more similar by belonging to this network and by interacting with other people in this network. We also forget about the fact that it may not be that people are egocentric. It could be that at a global level, people are not that egocentric, but at levels of individual processes, they can be completely egocentric. So we kind of think of the speakers and listeners as sort of unitary entities, but they can be broken down into subparts. And you also can see this with speakers. We think of speakers as being unitary. There's actually a social division of labor in communication. So designing, formulating, articulating messages, like quoting someone else, You often see this, people completing one another's utterances. Sometimes in a lot of real dialogue, it's actually hard to define who the speaker is, but what this means is that there are lots of other kind of associations that people can develop. And to actually see what people are using, you have to kind of take these things apart in the lab. I also think that the multimodal nature of communication has not really, I mean, people consider it. I don't want to say that people are ignoring it. I think a lot of the main theorists do consider communication to be multimodal, but I don't think it actually has the kind of impact on their theories that it should have. This kind of brings me kind of full circle to talking about Starkey again, because Starkey was somebody who really believed in the importance of looking at the richness of social interaction and all the various cues that are there that guide what we do and how we do it in real time. In every interaction, there are multiple channels of verbal and nonverbal parallel information exchange. So it can be very easy to detect if you're a speaker when your listener is sort of losing the thread of what you're saying. You can see, their eyes glaze over. You can see them break eye contact. You can see them fail to produce a back channel when you're expecting one. All those things are there in real time to kind of reduce the amount of modeling that you have to do of the other person. We know that people are very sensitive to these nonverbal cues. Even things like the length of hesitation can have a pretty substantial impact on what listeners expect speakers to say. And all of this suggests that real face-to-face multimodal interaction is a very forgiving environment for being egocentric. So you can kind of get away with a lot of these things because there are very powerful mechanisms for detecting and diagnosing when things go wrong. So I think the point is that if we want to get a full picture of how language use works, I think we have to really be careful about the kinds of idealizations that we make. And I'll just leave it with this quote from Wittgenstein, who I think flagged the dangers of idealization really well by saying, to understand the artichoke, we divest it of its leaves. So we sort of take apart the phenomenon that we're trying to understand, and we sort of lose the kind of holistic nature of this. Okay, so that's about all I have. And so thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.